Some truths never announce themselves out loud. They hide inside columns of figures, buried in ink and routine. They live in patterns no one bothers to look for, errors no one thinks to question, numbers that pass inspection simply because no one knows how to truly read them. And on the rare occasion when someone does learn how to decipher those figures, what they uncover can be far more unsettling than any carefully told lie. This is the story of a girl who was never meant to know her letters, let alone balance accounts. Yet she became the only person capable of managing the financial records of one of the largest plantations in South Carolina, and in doing so, she uncovered something that was never meant to be found. Sarah was 8 years old when she first realized that the world made sense to her in ways it didn't to others. Not because of magic or miracles, but because her mind naturally arranged chaos into order. Where others saw noise, she saw structure. Born on Fairmont Plantation, Sarah spent her early days much like the other children. Her mother worked in the main house, and Sarah was tasked with watching over the younger ones while the adults labored elsewhere. On the surface, her days were uneventful. But inside her head, nothing was ever still. She counted everything. The distance from the cabin to the creek, 247 steps along the packed dirt path, but only 231 if she slipped through the tall grass behind the smokehouse. The number of children wearing shoes compared to those without 12 in the winter months, when the cold demanded it, and only 3 in summer, when leather was redirected to field work instead. The rhythm of food distribution, always at dawn on Saturdays, except when rain came, in which case Mr. Advance postponed it until Sunday, likely unwilling to soil his boots in the mud. She noticed patterns in movement, too. The overseer's routine never varied: 3 visits a day to the cotton fields during harvest season, but only a single weekly trip to the distant pastures where broken tools and forgotten equipment sat undisturbed. To everyone else, these were meaningless details. To Sarah, they were the language of the world revealing itself, one number at a time. And long before anyone realized it, she was already learning how to read it. Sarah didn't just count. She remembered every number, every pattern, every deviation from the norm. That girl has her head in the clouds, old Martha would say, watching Sarah stare into the distance while the other children played, always looking at nothing with that thoughtful look on her face, like she's somewhere else entirely. But Sarah's head wasn't in the clouds. She was paying attention, more attention than anyone realized, more attention than would be prudent for someone in her position. She noticed that the overseer, Mr. Stevens, always limped more severely on Thursdays. She'd counted his steps and timed his rounds. Thursday was when he walked the entire property line, nearly 4 miles, checking fences. By evening, his old war injury would be bothering him, and he'd retire early. Thursdays were the safest days for small infractions, though Sarah never shared this observation with anyone. She noticed that Mrs. Vance ordered new fabric every 43 days, like clockwork. She noticed that the cook, old Esther, used exactly 2 handfuls of salt for every large pot of stew, and that when she used 3, it meant someone important was coming to dinner. She noticed that the dogs were restless 2 days before storms, and that the rooster that woke everyone at dawn was silent when frost was coming. Everything had a pattern. Everything had a rhythm, and Sarah saw it all. Fairmont Plantation had belonged to the Vance family for 3 generations. The original Vance, Thomas's grandfather, had built the property from nothing in the 1790s, starting with 200 acres and a dozen workers. By the time his son inherited, it had grown to nearly 8,000 acres with over 100 enslaved people working the cotton fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The current owner, Thomas Vance, had inherited the property at 23 after his father's premature death from a riding accident. That had been in 1836. 7 years ago now. Thomas was tall and thin with blonde hair that was already thinning despite his relative youth, and pale blue eyes that rarely seemed to focus directly on anyone. He had a reputation throughout the county for being a man of numbers, a detail-oriented proprietor who kept meticulous records of every aspect of his property, not like his father. Sarah had heard the house servants whisper, Old Mr. Vance ran everything by feel, by instinct. Young Thomas, he writes everything down, counts every seed, measures every bale. Some say he's smart. Others say he doesn't trust his own judgment. The plantation itself was impressive. Even Sarah had to admit. The main house was a grand 3-story structure with white columns and a wraparound porch sitting on a slight hill that overlooked the fields. Behind it were the various outbuildings, the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the laundry, the stables, the carriage house. Further back were the cabins where the field workers lived, arranged in neat rows like soldiers at attention, and beyond those the endless fields of cotton, white bowls catching the sunlight like snow in autumn. The problem Sarah had come to understand through whispered conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, was that Thomas Vance had difficulty keeping accountants. The first one, a young man fresh from a Charleston accounting firm, had left after only 6 months, citing health problems. "The climate doesn't agree with me," he told Mr. Vance, though the servant said he looked terrified when he'd packed his bags, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something terrible to appear. The second accountant, a middle-aged man from Virginia, had stayed a full year before departing abruptly one morning without even collecting his final wages. He left a brief note. "I cannot continue in this position. Please send my remaining pay to my family in Richmond." No explanation, no notice, just gone. The third, an elderly man named Herbert Crane, had arrived with the weary look of someone who'd heard the stories, but needed the work too desperately to refuse. He'd stayed the longest, nearly 2 years, before dying suddenly one February morning. The doctor said it was his heart simply gave out in his sleep. But some of the older workers murmured darker speculations late at night, talking about curses and bad luck and debts that followed families through generations. Sarah first saw the office when she was 9 years old. During that brief period between the second accountant's departure and Herbert Crane's arrival, her mother, Dilla, had been called to clean the room after the Virginia accountant's sudden exit. Dilla was trusted in the big house. She'd worked there since she was a girl herself. First in the kitchen, then as a chambermaid, and now as Mrs. Vance's personal attendant. She was quiet, efficient, and knew how to be invisible when necessary, qualities that made her valuable to the Vance family. Sarah had accompanied her that day, as she often did when there were tasks that required an extra pair of hands. At 9 years old, Sarah was considered old enough to help with light work, but not yet old enough to be assigned to the fields or a specific trade. "Don't touch anything," Dilla had warned as they entered the office, her voice carrying that tone that admitted no disobedience, especially not the papers on the desk. "Just help me with the dust on the shelves, and we'll be out of here quickly." Mr. Vance is particular about this room. But even as Sarah had nodded obediently, picked up her dusting cloth, and approached the shelves, she couldn't stop her eyes from wandering, couldn't stop her mind from absorbing every detail of this forbidden space. The office was smaller than she'd imagined, perhaps 15 feet square, with a single large window overlooking the front lawn. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with dark wooden shelves, and those shelves were packed with books. Not the kind of books Mrs. Vance kept in the parlor for show, leather-bound volumes of poetry and philosophy that no one ever read. These were working books, practical books, their spines worn from constant use. Ledgers. Dozens of them, maybe over 100, each one thick as a Bible, bound in brown or black leather with years marked on the spines in fading gold letters. 1825, 1830, 1835, 1840. A complete history of Fairmont Plantation measured in pounds of cotton and dollars earned, all organized chronologically on those shelves. In the center of the room stood a massive oak desk, its surface scarred with years of use. An inkwell sat in one corner, the glass thick with dried black residue. A collection of pens lay scattered across the surface, some with nibs so worn they'd split, and covering nearly every inch of available space were papers, loose sheets covered with neat columns of numbers and words, pages that had been torn from ledgers, notes scrolled in margins, calculations worked out in the spaces between other calculations. It was chaos and order simultaneously. A mess that somehow made sense. A system that looked like disorder to the untrained eye, but clearly had its own internal logic. Sarah had moved closer to the desk, her dusting cloth hanging forgotten in her hand, drawn by those mysterious symbols marching across the pages in perfect rows. Numbers. She recognized those 1579. She could count. After all, everyone could count, at least a little. But these numbers were arranged in ways that suggested meaning beyond simple counting. They were organized into columns with lines drawn between them. They were added together, creating sums at the bottom of pages. They told a story, if only she could read it. And there were other symbols, too. Curving lines and straight marks that she knew represented words, though she had no idea which words or what they meant. Her mother had told her these were called letters, and that when you put them together in the right order, they made sounds, and the sounds made words, and the words had meaning. Sarah had reached out, her small brown hand hovering inches above a page filled with those mysterious symbols, wanting desperately to touch it, to somehow absorb its secrets through her fingertips. Sarah. Dilla's voice had cracked like a whip, sharp with fear. Get away from that desk now. Sarah had jumped back as if burned, spinning to face her mother. Dilla had crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the desk. Her grip was tight enough to hurt, her eyes wide with something beyond anger. Genuine terror. Do you have any idea what would happen if Mr. Vance came in and saw you touching his private papers? Do you? Dilla had whispered fiercely, her voice barely above a breath, but somehow more forceful than a shout. I'm sorry, Mama. I didn't touch anything. I don't care what you stay away from that desk, away from those papers, away from anything in this room except the dust I told you to wipe. Do you understand me? Sarah had nodded, chastened, but not quite repentant. Because even as her mother pulled her away, even as she returned to the safe task of dusting the shelves, her mind was still at the desk, still seeing those numbers and letters, still wondering what secrets they contained. They'd finished the cleaning in silence, and when they'd left, Dilla had locked the door behind them with the key Mrs. Vance had provided, but it was too late. Sarah had seen and something inside her, that part that counted and organized and saw patterns in everything, had awakened like a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. That night, lying on her thin mattress of straw in the cabin she shared with her mother and 2 other families, Sarah had taken a small stick and begun drawing in the dirt floor beside her bed. She tried to reproduce the symbols she'd seen. The numbers were easy. She knew those. 1 looked like a straight line. 5 was a line with curves. 7 was an angle. She drew them carefully, checking her memory against each mark in the dirt. But the letters were harder. She'd seen so many of them in so many different combinations. There was one that looked like a circle that appeared frequently, another that was like a cross, one that reminded her of a snake. She drew them all, trying to commit them to memory, trying to create some system in her mind to organize and understand them. Sarah, what are you doing? Dilla's voice had come from the darkness, tired and weary. Nothing, Mama. Stop whatever it is and go to sleep. But Sarah had heard the resignation in her mother's voice, that tone that said Dilla knew her daughter was doing something she shouldn't, but was too exhausted to fight about it. Mama, Sarah had whispered after a moment. Those marks on the papers in the office. What are they? A long silence. Sarah could hear her mother's breathing in the dark, could sense her internal debate about whether to answer. Finally, with a deep sigh, they're records, Sarah, numbers that tell how much cotton was planted in each field, how much was harvested, how much was sold, and for what price. They track how much money was spent on seeds and tools, and she'd paused. And other things. The numbers tell all that. The numbers and the words together. The words say what the numbers are measuring. Like the word cotton next to a number tells you that number means pounds of cotton. The word dollars tells you the number means money. Sarah had absorbed this, her mind racing. And the other words, the ones that aren't about cotton or money. Names, places, dates. Everything that happens on a plantation gets written down. Sarah, everything that matters to the people who own it. There'd been a bitter edge to Dilla's voice on that last part. Can you read the words, Mama? Number. The answer had been sharp, almost violent in its intensity. And you won't learn either. It's forbidden, Sarah, against the law. Do you understand? Slaves and people like us, we're not allowed to read or write. If we're caught trying, the punishment is severe. Very severe. But why? If it's just marks on paper. Because knowledge is power, Dilla had interrupted, her voice softer now, but no less intense. Because if we could read the newspapers and learn about the world beyond this plantation. We could read the laws and know our rights, the few we have. We could write passes and travel. We could forge documents. We could organize. The people who make the rules know that, Sarah. That's why it's forbidden. Sarah had processed this information in silence. The prohibition made sense in a terrible sort of way. If reading was powerful enough to be forbidden, then it must be valuable indeed. You're too curious, Dilla had said quietly. It scares me sometimes how much you want to know. Curiosity is dangerous for people like us. It draws attention. It makes you dissatisfied. It makes you ask questions that have no good answers. She'd paused. Promise me you'll forget about those papers. Promise me you'll put this out of your mind. I promise, Mama, Sarah had said. But even as the words left her mouth, she'd known it was a lie. She couldn't forget. Wouldn't forget. The symbols on those pages had called to something deep inside her, something that needed to understand, to organize, to know. She'd lain awake long after her mother's breathing had deepened into sleep, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of the cabin, her mind full of numbers and letters and questions that had no answers yet. But they would. Somehow, someday Sarah would find those answers. She just had to be patient. And patient she was learning was something she could be when it mattered. The third accountant, Herbert Crane, arrived at Fairmont on a cool October afternoon when Sarah was 10 years old. She'd been in the yard behind the kitchen house helping to pluck chickens for that evening's dinner when the carriage had rolled up the long drive. It wasn't Mr. Vance's carriage. That one she would have recognized immediately. This was a hired vehicle from town, dusty from the road, pulled by two tired-looking horses. The driver had climbed down first, then opened the door for the passenger. Herbert Crane had emerged slowly, carefully, like a man who'd learned not to trust his own body. He was old, truly old, not just middle-aged like Mr. Vance, but genuinely elderly. Sarah guessed he must be past 70. His face was deeply lined like leather left too long in the sun, and his hair was white and sparse, revealing patches of age-spotted scalp. He wore spectacles with thick lenses that magnified his pale blue eyes, making him look perpetually startled. But it was his hands that drew Sarah's attention. They trembled constantly, a fine shake that made him fumble with his walking stick as he steadied himself against the carriage. When he reached back inside to retrieve his bag, she could see the effort it cost him just to maintain his grip. Mr. Vance had come out to greet him, and Sarah had watched the exchange from her position at the plucking table, her hands automatically continuing to work, while her attention was focused entirely on the two men. Mr. Crane, welcome to Fairmont. Mr. Vance's voice had carried across the yard, professionally friendly, but with an undertone of desperation. This was his fourth accountant in 7 years, after all. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous. Long, Mr. Vance, but not unbearable. Herbert's voice was surprisingly strong for such a frail-looking man, cultured and precise. Your directions were excellent. Let me help you with your bag. I can manage, thank you. Herbert had hefted the worn leather case himself, though Sarah could see it was heavy, and his arms shook with the effort. I may be old, sir, but I'm not yet helpless. Of course, of course. Well, let me show you to your quarters. I've had the clerk's cottage prepared for you. It's modest, but private and close to the office for convenience. They'd walked toward the back of the property, Mr. Vance, matching his pace to Herbert's slow, careful steps. Sarah had watched them go, noting the way Herbert paused every dozen steps to catch his breath, the way he leaned heavily on his walking stick, The way Mr. Vance hovered nearby like he expected the old man to collapse at any moment. "That one won't last 6 months," Esther had muttered from her position at the kitchen door where she'd also been watching. "Too old, too frail. This place eats accountants alive, and that one's already half gone." But Esther, Sarah would learn, was wrong. Herbert Crane had a core of steel beneath that fragile exterior. The Clark's cottage was a small building at the edge of the main property, tucked between the big house and the working areas of the plantation. It had 2 rooms, a bedroom and a sitting room that could double as a study and a small covered porch. It was traditionally reserved for trusted employees who weren't family, but ranked above the common workers. Previous accountants, the plantation's doctor during his brief tenures, once even a tutor Mr. Vance had hired for a year before deciding formal education wasn't worth the expense. Sarah had learned all this from listening to conversations, from piecing together fragments of information over years of quiet observation. She'd never been inside the cottage herself. There'd been no reason to. But she knew its layout, knew that it had a stone chimney on the north wall and 2 windows facing east toward the rising sun. It was 3 days after Herbert Crane's arrival that old Martha took ill. Martha was ancient, well past 80 by her own accounting, and had been at Fairmont longer than anyone could remember. She'd raised 2 generations of Vances, including Mr. Thomas's father, and in her old age had been relegated to light duties, supervising the youngest children, doing simple mending, occasionally carrying messages or meals to workers in the outer buildings. Her legs had been bothering her for months, swelling up like tree trunks by evening, making each step painful. Dilla had tried to help with compresses and elevation, but age was age, and Martha's body was simply wearing out. When she finally couldn't walk at all, confined to her bed in the cabin she shared with her daughter and grandchildren, someone had to take over her duties. "Sarah can handle it," Dilla had suggested to Mrs. Vance during one of their morning conferences where the day's tasks were discussed and distributed. "She's responsible, discreet, and knows how to move quietly." Martha's duties aren't difficult, just time-consuming. Mrs. Vance had considered this, her sharp eyes evaluating Sarah, who stood quietly in the corner of the room, as she often did when accompanying her mother. "She's rather young," Mrs. Vance had said. "What is she, 9, 10, Mom?" "Old enough to be trustworthy." "Very well. She can take over the meal deliveries and the message running, but make sure she understands the importance of discretion. Mr. Crane is to be treated with respect and given privacy. I don't want him bothered." "Yes, Mom." Sarah understands. And so Sarah found herself twice daily walking to the Clark's cottage with a tray of food for Herbert Crane. The first few times she'd simply knocked, waited for his call to enter, deposited the tray on the small table just inside the door, bobbed a quick curtsy, and left. The entire interaction took less than a minute. Herbert would nod his thanks, sometimes say much appreciated, and return his attention to whatever he'd been doing. Usually reading, Sarah noticed. Always reading, not ledgers, but books. Real books with proper bindings and printed pages. But on the 4th day, as Sarah was setting down his dinner tray, Herbert had spoken. "You're Dilla's girl, aren't you?" Sarah had paused, surprised at being directly addressed. "Yes, sir." "She's an excellent worker. Your mother." It must have been a final act of sabotage after I dismissed her. "Your former assistant was the young woman I saw helping in the house." She understood financial systems well enough to identify embezzlement. She had some limited training, enough to make mischief, apparently. "With respect, sir, whoever wrote that note had more than limited training. They understood complex accounting principles, cross-referencing, pattern analysis, and more importantly, the information appears to be accurate. These purchases are fraudulent." "Mr. Hayes, I'll handle this matter personally." "You needn't concern yourself." "Actually, sir, I do need to concern myself. According to the documents you showed me when I was hired, the Bank of Charleston holds the primary mortgage on this property. As part of the loan agreement, they have the right to audit the accounts at any time. If they discover irregularities, and I, as the accountant of record, failed to report them, I could be held liable." "Are you threatening me?" Hayes: No, sir. I'm explaining my professional obligations. If there's evidence of embezzlement or fraud in these books, I need to report it to the appropriate authorities. That's not a choice. It's a legal requirement. Sarah had heard footsteps, then a door slamming. Mr. Vance must have left. That night, Mr. Vance didn't come home. Sarah learned the next morning from the household gossip that he'd been seen riding toward Charleston late in the evening, a single bag strapped to his horse. By noon, it was clear he wasn't returning. Mrs. Vance had been distraught, demanding answers from the staff, but no one knew anything. Hayes, meanwhile, had sent an urgent message to the Bank of Charleston, reporting suspected financial irregularities and the property owner's abrupt disappearance. The bank's response was swift. A representative arrived within 2 days, a stern, efficient man named Mr. Williams, who'd come to assess the situation and protect the bank's interests. He'd taken over the office, immediately reviewing every ledger. With Hayes at his side, they'd worked for a full day, examining the records, calculating losses, determining the scope of Mr. Vance's theft. Sarah had watched from various vantage points, seeing the grim expressions, the shaking heads, the steadily growing pile of flagged entries. On the third day, Mr. Williams had called a meeting of the household staff. Thomas Vance has defaulted on his loan through criminal misconduct, he'd announced. The Bank of Charleston is assuming immediate control of this property. All operations will continue as normal while we determine how to proceed. But you should be aware that Fairmont will likely be sold to satisfy the debt. Murmurs of worry had rippled through the assembled workers. What about us? Someone had called out. Will we be sold? That will be determined by whoever purchases the property. The bank's priority is recovering the loan value. I can't make promises beyond that. Fear had spread through the quarters that night. Being sold was every enslaved person's nightmare. Families separated, people sent to different states, children torn from parents. Sarah and Dilla had held each other in their cabin, knowing that their relatively comfortable life at Fairmont was ending, uncertain what would replace it. The next morning, Mr. Williams had sent for Sarah. She'd approached the office with trepidation, unsure what to expect. Williams and Hayes were both there, seated at the desk, a ledger open between them. Sarah, correct? Williams had asked. Yes, sir. Mr. Hayes has informed me that you had some involvement with maintaining these records. Is that accurate? Sarah had glanced at Hayes, trying to read his expression. He looked back neutrally, giving nothing away. I helped Mr. Crane, the previous accountant, sir. He taught me some basic bookkeeping. Basic bookkeeping? Williams had repeated, a note of skepticism in his voice. Mr. Hayes, show her the entry from March 3rd. Hayes had pointed to a line in the ledger. Can you explain what this entry means? Williams had asked. Sarah had scanned it quickly. It's a cotton future sale, sir. 200 bales contracted for delivery in October at $48 per bale. Total value $9,600. And this notation here, Williams had pointed to a marginal note. That's the hedge calculation. If the market price drops below $45 per bale by delivery date, we still profit. But if it rises above 52, we would have been better off waiting to sell. The notation marks the acceptable risk range. Williams and Hayes had exchanged a glance. Basic bookkeeping, Williams had said dryly. Miss Sarah, I've reviewed these ledgers extensively. The entries from the past 4 years show a level of sophistication and attention to detail that exceeds most professional accountants I've worked with. The cross-referencing system, the projection models, the risk analysis. This is expert work. Sarah had said nothing, unsure where this was leading. I've also found this. Williams had held up the note Sarah had left. This is your handwriting, isn't it? Ah, yes, sir. You left this information for Mr. Hayes to find. You exposed Mr. Vance's theft, knowing it would trigger an investigation. I just wanted the truth known, sir. The numbers should be honest. Williams had studied her for a long moment. You're remarkably talented and clearly principled, which is rare. The bank is going to maintain operations here while we find a buyer. That means we need someone to manage the records in the interim. Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes will serve as the official accountant of record. Yes. Society and the law require that. But we both know these books need someone who truly understands them, someone who knows Fairmont's operations intimately. He'd paused. I'd like to offer you an unusual arrangement. Sir, you'll continue managing the actual ledgers. Mr. Hayes will review your work and serve as the public face, but you'll do the detailed accounting. In exchange, you and your mother will remain at Fairmont with protected status. You'll be compensated with better conditions, and I'll make sure that when this property is eventually sold, your sales contracts include specific guarantees. What kind of guarantees? That you and your mother won't be separated. That you'll continue in administrative roles rather than field work. That your new owner will be someone who values skilled labor appropriately. It wasn't freedom, but it was protection and acknowledgement of her skills. Why would you do this, sir? Sarah had asked. Williams had smiled slightly. Because I'm a banker, Miss Sarah. I understand value, and I know waste when I see it. Your mind is worth more than any field labor could ever generate. It would be poor business to waste such an asset. He paused, and because that note you left showed more integrity than most free men I know. The bank appreciates integrity. Sarah glanced toward her mother, Dilla, who had been summoned and now stood quietly near the doorway. Dilla met her daughter's eyes, held them for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. I accept, sir. Thank you. With that, Sarah's formal position began as Fairmont Plantation's true accountant, concealed behind Hayes's public authority. In November of 1847, Fairmont was sold to the Randolph family of Virginia. They were younger than the Vances, more inclined toward modern thinking, and perhaps most importantly willing to tolerate the unusual arrangement the bank required as a condition of sale. Sarah remained in her role. This time, her work came with a measure of acknowledgement. The Randolphs understood her value. They treated her with cautious respect and, on occasion, asked for her opinion directly on matters of business. It was not freedom. She was still enslaved, still property, still bound to the land and to those who claimed ownership over her life. Yet she possessed something rare, a